Take two. Kyle here from All Media Reviews. Here to do the Rock Hall snub list video. And instead of doing it 70 to 1 or 35 to 1, this is going to be like the top 35, but starting at 1 to 35 just because people don't necessarily watch the whole thing. So number one is the Monkees. They were a real band. They played on their instruments. They sang obviously on their instruments. They wrote a lot of their music, especially after the first two albums. Um, it's egregious. They're more famous than a third or maybe half the bands in there, and they influence so many bands that are in there, so many artists that are in there. But they're number one. Number two, King Crimson came out on top when I did the comparison on Pubmeeple. I mean, the prog bands, they're not the biggest name among the prog bands that aren't in, that have never even been nominated either. But in terms of influence and actually critical, like sort of recognition and respect, and they're in some ways the most egregious. I can understand that. So because they came out, their debut album came out in '69. You have Rush and Yes in there and Genesis in there, and they influenced all those bands. So number three, another prog band, but you have right after that. It was pretty close between those two, I think, in the results I did. Jethro Tull. And they've been mentioned several times on blogs and podcasts and stuff like that, and social media. Ian Anderson wants to blow it off, but Locomotive Breath alone is a classic rock staple and Living in the Past, and albums like Aqualung and Thick as a Brick especially, and then some of the others. They got won the Grammy in the '80s for best hard rock, also heavy metal, defeating Metallica for Crest of a Knave. Um, yeah, but Jethro Tull should be in, and among the prog bands, even though King Crimson was more influential, and they started around the same time actually, but they were more of a blues band at that point. Jethro Tull is a more of a bigger household name than them, but Rock and Roll Hall of Fame being famous. So number four, In Excess, maybe the biggest band at this point that was in the '80s that has not even been nominated or been mentioned, but there's at least a campaign for them. So especially the Kick album, and they had several other hits throughout about four or five other records, I believe, all the way up through, was it X that came out in '90? But R.I.P. Michael Hutchins, of course. But I think they will get in at some point. The fact they're from Australia doesn't help their cause, unfortunately. That's probably, but they were almost as big as U2 and Duran Duran. I just they should be in. They should be going in before a lot of these bands and artists that have come that started after them. But anyway, number four. Number five, Iron Maiden. Now they have been nominated twice. I have a feeling if they get nominated two more, like if they get nominated again and don't get in, they'll get put in a year or two after that. But yeah, and they're the biggest metal band that's not in, even though there aren't that many metal bands in. They have the iconic Eddie. They have albums like Number of the Beast and Power Slave and Peace of Mind. '80s albums, especially the Bruce Dickinson era. They could include Paul Di'Anno, even though he just passed away, unfortunately, the first two records. But yeah, Iron Maiden should get in. The metal thing, I think there's a reasonable chance they'll end up getting in the way that Judas Priest got in. But yeah, number five. Number six, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. While they're a little bit of a punchline, they were huge. They had those big semi trucks with each member, and they played stadiums and everything in the '70s. Albums like the debut album, Trilogy, Aqualung, or Tarkus rather, Tarkus, and Brain Cell Surgery might be their most iconic with the H.R. Geiger artwork and everything like that. Um, yeah, I mean they had some hits too. I mean, there's just a lot of reasons why they should be in. They were very influential, even though they were kind of they came across as being self-indulgent, and they interpreted classic work, so they were very ostentatious to some degree. You could call them that, but a huge part of where progressive rock went and was, if you have Yes and Genesis in there, you really have to have Emerson, Lake and Palmer in there too. Anyway, number six. Number seven, Pat Metheny slash Pat Metheny Group. While this is partially a bias on my own personal taste, he has his level of success that cross over boundaries outside of jazz. Um, but he did have a little commercial success with the Falcon and the Snowman soundtrack. I believe Bowie sang on that, I think, on that soundtrack anyway. But among like the jazz community and like jazz rock, um, he's very innovative, very influential among guitarists, rock guitarists included. Um, and he's been around since the 70s, and there's other jazz fusion artists, I guess, that are maybe as if not more important, but I think sort of his career being as prolific as he's been, he almost gets credit, gets more recognition, more appreciation and interest to actually show up in this, because he has a song like Roots of Coincidence on Imaginary Day that's not jazz, it's definitely rock music. But you have your likes of like Peter Gabriel and everything like that in there, and Paul Simon and Talking Heads using like ethnic and Afrobeat and that kind of stuff, percussion. He used some of that in a lot of his music too. But yeah, he's important. I don't think the odds of him getting there are very high compared to some of the other names, but maybe at some point. Number 8, Supertramp, a classic rock staple, progressive pop, um, almost bordering on yacht rock, but though they were British. Um, many big hits like Give a Little Bit and Dreamer and Breakfast in America itself, the title track, had several of their hits. Logical Song, Bloody Well Right. They had several just classic rock stapled songs, and I don't know, I think they were generally considered, they were respected for the most part. But they kind of were on the fringe in that everyone liked them, but they didn't really like think of them as a massive influence. But I think their influence is being felt the last 30 years, especially on the stuff I like, the progressive pop stuff, where you can be poppy and be kind of have instrumentation and very kind of, so their albums besides Breakfast in America, oh, the one with the criminal, am I thinking of Criminal Minds? That's the album with Bloody Well Right. And even the Quietest Moments, am I blanking on? They had the one album in the 80s that was successful. Anyway, I think Supertramp really needs to get in. I think there's a chance they will get in. If they get nominated, like Bad Company, they're as if not more well known than Bad Company. Their songs have been used in movies and commercials and stuff like that. Why can't I remember the name of that album? It's gonna bug. I'll put it in the description. Anyway, Supertramp number 8, number 9, and I almost think I would probably, if I were gonna tweak this a little bit, put this band a little bit higher. Toto played on Thriller. Toto has Africa, Rosanna, Hold the Line, several hits. Master musicians. Jeff Porcaro specifically, maybe he could put in as a musical excellence alone, because he played on Steely Dan albums and he played on The Wall from Pink Floyd and several other records. Yeah, that they refused to be on the cover of Rolling Stone in '82, and they kind of maybe got a bad reputation with Rolling Stone. That may be partly why they'd never been nominated, but it's pretty egregious, for the Thriller part alone. Human Nature was basically written by Steve Lukather, I think. It was the keyboard player, Steve Porcaro. Um, yeah, Toto. I think if they get nominated, they will get in. But the question is, will they get nominated? Hopefully sooner than later. Number 10, Crime of the Century. That was the name of the album I was spacing on. Number 10, Faith No More. Talked about it many times. If you have the likes of Rage Against the Machine and any out the grunge bands too, actually, I would say any rap metal. I mean, Limp Bizkit and Korn aren't in, but if they ever get in, this is pathetic that Faith No More wouldn't get in first. They combine rap with rock, you could say. They kind of were one of the first ones to really do that, and they were very experimental, very kind of socio-political, kind of sarcastic, especially with the Mike Patton era. I guess if they did put him in, would they include Chuck Mosley? They might, or they might not. Just the Mike Patton era from The Real Thing, which had Epic, of course, their one massive #1 hit, all the way through even Soul Invictus a couple years ago. But it was like almost 10 years ago, or at least Album of the Year. But yeah, Faith No More, and I think if they got on the ballot, there's a pretty good chance they would get. I'm not certain. but they did get pretty massive, and Mike Patton's name become. Of course, he did Mr. Bungle and several other projects, but I would be really happy. I don't know if I've never seen them in concert, so necessarily go to see them get inducted, but they got in. They need to go in. Those, I mean, having the grunge bands get in. I mean, if Alice in Chains, if some of those other bands get in, if Linkin Park ever gets in, that is pathetic because Faith No More, they wouldn't exist without them, but we'll see. Number 11, Tears for Fears. Of course, Songs for the Big Chair was a massive, like, it was like diamond or multi-platinum album. Everybody Wants to Rule the World, using like Real Genius and several other movies. Um, Shout and Head Over Heels. Those three songs alone should be putting them in the Rock Hall. They've done tours, of course, recently. One with Hall and Oates, who got in much later than they should have, but did get in. But pop rock again, if you put the likes of Duran Duran and U2, Tears for Fears are right there in terms of 80s sort of pop rock bands. Although they were kind of progressive in a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, and they had some, everyone knows, not everyone, but a lot of people know Mad World, the version by Gary Jules, of course, from Donnie Darko. But yeah, I mean, their first album, The Hurting, had several known tracks as well, and then Seeds of Love as well. Those three records in the 80s, especially. Yeah, I think if they got on the ballot, there's a pretty good chance they would get in, or they would get in within a couple years. But I think they should be getting in instead of the likes of Joy Division and New Order, and you've already put The Cure and Depeche Mode in. Tears for Fears, arguably as big, if not bigger in some ways. Anyway, I mean, they did a documentary about them. It was in theaters. So number 11, number 12, Phil Collins. How many top 10 hits and the number one hits did he have? And they started putting pop acts in like 2011, 2012 with Madonna. You know, he's obvious. I know he's in with Genesis, but you just put Ozzy Osbourne in. He was in with Black Sabbath previously. Phil Collins, like George Michael, like Whitney Houston, and I'll put Mariah Carey, but he predates of Mariah Carey, like Janet Jackson, 80s pop artists, like Diamond. Everyone knows Phil Collins. I know it's pop, light FM pop music, and sometimes the Genesis songs sound like Phil Collins songs and vice versa in the 80s, but in early 90s. Yeah, and I think if he got on the ballot, I don't know, the whole thing with Mariah, would they be considering his work with Genesis? You wouldn't want to necessarily, but again, you put Peter Gabriel in, so yeah. So Phil Collins needs to be in. I think he'll be put in as either influence or probably excellence if he doesn't get put in through the ballot at some point soon. He's getting up there, that documentary about him. So number 13, Robert Palmer. While he had I wouldn't call it a short window of time, but I mean his work in the 70s, I don't know nearly as well. I've only heard a few songs from that, but his work in the 80s, though, he got really big, and then his stuff with Power Station as well. But yeah, I mean, he was a really big frontman songwriter, and I know Gen Z and probably millennials don't remember how big he was, but he was really big. Simply Irresistible. This cover of I Didn't Mean to Turn You On. What was the other one? He just had some videos like Peter Gabriel, like Phil Collins. He was a very much of a known, almost iconic figure of the 80s with MTV especially. And he passed away in 2003, so I mean it's Warren Zevon's getting put in. I could see him being put in the same way Warren Zevon, but he's more of an 80s artist, even though he started in the 70s. But Robert Palmer needs to get in. I'm surprised there has been more push for him to get in, but anyway. Number 13. Number 14, Huey Lewis and the News. Tears for Fears and on this list, Tears for Fears and even Toto was considered an 80s artist, I guess, to some degree, but acts from the 80s, they were massive, of course. They had Back to the Future soundtrack, Back to the Future, Power of Love and Back in Time, and then, of course, the sports album. Some of the things where he had, I Wanted to Drug, and was it Ray Parker Jr.'s Ghostbusters sounded similar, but, the sports album had 4, 5, 6 songs that got played frequently. They still get played on 80s radio songs, on the charts and stuff. The four record, his 80s albums especially. I don't know if Weird Al ever did a. Oh yeah, he did. I want to. No, I'm thinking of Like a Surgeon from. I thought Weird Al did do a parody of one of his songs. Anyway, um, I think again, like Cyndi Lauper, he iconic enough. I mean, Huey Lewis was on We Are the World, you know, like Cyndi Lauper. Um, he's big enough. I don't know if he get on the first ballot, but if he gets nominated, they'll be pushed for Huey Lewis and the News to get in. And they could get in on the first ballot. I think it's you're putting in Soundgarden and the White Stripes, and you're not putting years before even. He's eligible probably in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. So Huey Lewis and the News, number 14. Number 15, XTC. While commercially they were never fully that big. I mean, the Skylark record was pretty big, produced by Todd Rundgren, who is in the Rock Hall now. But critically, they've been praised, and I think their notoriety and recognition and fame has risen the last 10 to 15 years because they've been cited recently. Andy Partridge wrote songs. He's worked with people, and he's wrote songs for the Monkees. Um, you know, a lot of artists have just continually referenced them. They're a cult that's grown. I mean, I didn't hear about them 20, 25 years ago very often. I knew the name, but their music I wasn't that familiar with. But the last couple decades, they've become very popular. They had a documentary called I Like Pop, I think it was called. Um, like Pop, something like that. Anyway, but yeah, and they have their share of pop songs that would appeal to voters if they heard them if they're not familiar with them. But I mean, I think that they had enough success even though they were kind of on the fringe of mainstream exposure. But the problem was like Annie's vocals were a little weird. Some of the songs were a little weird. They were more of a musician's band to some degree, but they fit into several like demographics of music taste between like post punk and punk, art rock and pop. So they kind of they 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 check off a bunch of boxes. The whole non-touring because of Andy Partridge's condition where he became stage fright probably did hurt them their ability to really become more of a household name. But I mean, I guess you could say, well, like the Replacements and some of the other bands from the '80s that had cult followings could also get in. But actually, they go back before some of those bands. I mean, REM's in, of course, but the Talking Heads are in. But um, I think there would be a push for them. I don't know if they'd be able to get in, but I think they'd have a better chance of getting in than, say, someone like Billy Idol, actually, in some ways. At least from the voting base of the Rock Hall, the musicians that are in the Rock Hall and the critics would appreciate that. I don't know. Number 16, Dio or Ronnie James Dio. Well, Black Sabbath is in. He did not get in with Sabbath. Obviously, Rainbow's not in either, but he would probably best be put in for musical excellence. But he's an iconic vocalist. He was R.I.P. Ronnie James Dio. His work obviously with Rainbow, with Black Sabbath, and his solo work alone. Even that his band was it Egg or was it not Egg? Egg. I forget the band he was in before he joined Rainbow, but yeah, he's an iconic vocalist that's surprising hasn't been considered. I think part of it's because they put Black Sabbath in, but putting Ozzy Osbourne in last year. Well, Ozzy Osbourne's more famous than him. He's still famous enough. It was a really hard thing to deal with when he passed away, But I mean, he invented supposedly invented or he passed along in the metal culture and the rock culture, the horns, which a lot of people use. They don't have any idea where it came from or even listen to metal. But yeah, Ronnie James Dio, Holy Diver. I mean, he's got the stuff his body of work from that like 10-year period, especially from the mid '70s to the mid '80s. So number 17, Styx. So probably the biggest name at this point, close to the biggest name. Them are REO Speedwagon, the quote unquote AOR bands. I mean, their music's been referenced several times, like in movies and television, on South Park. I mean, they 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 can sell out arenas. They're still putting out new music. I don't know if they put them in. They'd have to have Dennis DeYoung, but and Tom. I don't know what line all the guys that would get in, but I think it's inevitable if they get on the ballot. they will get in. I'm almost certain of that, given the fact that both Bad Company and Foreigner both did the last couple of years. It's a matter of they got to get, they're a little bit of a guilty pleasure to some people that like them, love them, but the people that don't like them may go out of their way to say how corny and cheesy their music is. But Come Sail Away alone was massive. And some of the other songs, Babe. Of course, they did the rock opera Kilroy's here, and people, Mr. Roboto, but uh, I they got to get in. It may be a point. Unfortunately, it may still take some time, but with these AOR bands and the classic rock bands that are brought up, they wouldn't go in the same class with necessarily with Toto and REO Speedwagon, unfortunately, or Boston. But anyway, Styx. So next, right after them, is Kansas. Now they are AOR in classic rock, but they're also progressive rock, and they had a few big hits: "Carry On Wayward Son" and "Dust in the Wind," of course. Albums, the first 5, 6 albums, especially the Kerry Livgren era, um, especially would be from my standpoint that we would look at. There's a lot of like Styx and some of these bands. They have this umbrella of membership, but the early lineup I think would be what they would take. But you know, from a standpoint of like, you know, they've done tours with your Jethro Tulls and your Styxes and stuff like that, and they never end up being the headliner. They've headlined at like slightly smaller venues from a live standpoint, but they had those hits though. Point of No Return, that song is a classic rock staple. I don't know. I think Styx, Toto, and probably REO Speedwagon would probably get nominated before them, even though I would put them ahead of REO Speedwagon, of course. But number 18, number 19. So I'm putting John McLaughlin, just like Pat Metheny. John McLaughlin with, again, for the musicians, in jazz fusion, the Miles Davis umbrella. More jazz needs to be put in here. So in my mind, John McLaughlin's one of not the biggest name in jazz fusion, jazz rock, and the musicians that worked with Miles Davis. The stuff with Mahavishnu Orchestra, of course, and then, of course, his stuff with Shakti and his solo stuff and several other collaborations would make sense. But I think it's a better chance he would end up being as a musical excellence. But he's getting up there. British guy who's the industry people know him. He's won Grammys, I'm pretty sure. Just like Chick Corea, who's not around anymore. But so number 20, Tangerine Dream. Kraftwerk is in. I believe Tangerine Dream actually predate them, but Tangerine Dream, while maybe on some levels among hipsters especially, they're not as big Tangerine Dream as Kraftwerk. I've said that basically before they got in. My friend John said the same thing, and even since, is that if you're putting Kraftwerk in, Tangerine Dream really needs to be in. They've done soundtracks that got them some recognition, like the Legend soundtrack, and highly prolific. They have like 70 or 80 albums or something like that. But from a standpoint of like instrumental like keyboard and synthesizer driven, and sort of the evolution of the keyboards and the synthesizer, use in modern music, rock music, if you want to call it. It's progressive rock of a sort, progressive ambient, progressive space rock. You could say also Hawkwind, but I think from a sort of industry notoriety and respect and influence, even to a lot of degrees, Tangerine Dream's influence is probably even bigger. Anyway, they're number 20. Number 21, Michael Nesmith. Of course, he had a career after a pretty prolific career after the Monkees, after he left the Monkees. Also he had a huge part in the sort of development and how MTV basically came to be. But just on his music alone, the style of sort of forward-thinking country music. Even some of his music doesn't even is outside of country music, but the first national bands, of course. I don't know the odds of him getting in, although before the Monkees, but he could be put in as a category. But I mean, it's hard to believe. He even had a few sort of minor hits with like Rio and Joanne. Like the first or second music videos. So, of course, he passed away in 2021, the end of 2021, so he won't even be there. But his estate, his children, obviously would be able to accept it. But it's fantasy anyway. Number 22, Joe Jackson. While I'm hardly even like highly versed in everything he's done, I'm still kind of getting to know his career. He had several pop hits and he had a lot of respect. And he kind of also marched to the beat of his own drum. Thinking of different drum than Michael Nesmith, but I mean, stepping out has become kind of a mantra, like a sort of a theme for the early '80s. Um, is she really going out with him? And he's also a producer. He's done, he's got a lot of records. He's collaborated with a lot of people like Suzanne Vega. Just learning about the passing of Jill Sobule, he also worked with her. Sobule, well, Sobule, R.I.P. But I guess she was in the fire that happened was in Woodbury, east of where I live. But yeah, Joe Jackson would be great. I think he's a cult artist. He's not as big as Elvis Costello, but considering how long ago Elvis Costello got in, he came around not that long after Elvis Costello did. It's kind of surprising that Joe Jackson's ever even considered. So number 22, number 23. Yes, the Carpenters. Pretty egregious. Now again, were they rock music and rock and roll? Not exactly, but if you're talking about what they did, pop and kind of folk and um orchestral pop of sorts. Some of it almost was stereotyped as like not Christian music, but anyway, they had several pop hits that were like sunshine pop and pop folk pop of the early to mid '70s, especially. And Karen Carpenter had this angelic voice. There's been several things in sort of pop culture and media that has been talked about and shown about her influence, and then them as a whole, the Carpenters. I think some of the stereotype is they almost were considered like very conservative value music, and that the critics and people for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame wouldn't consider it. But you putting in Willie Nelson, you're putting in I mean he's more of a rebel, but Dolly Parton, you're putting in Jimmy Buffett. The Carpenters have way more sort of cred and of a resume and a sort of pop culture notoriety from just the list of songs than as at least as much if not more that they need to be in there. I mean, they had number one hits in the early to mid '70s. They had a TV show. They need to be in, I mean, it's egregious that they've never been nominated. So again, it's the whole like umbrella opening from 15, 20, 25, 30 years ago. It would just had to be rock and roll, blues, rock, just that was it, for the most part. And just some of the pop acts, the iconic pop acts of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But yeah, I think it's way overdue. But I think if they got on the ballot, they would probably get in because they have that following and notoriety. Let's see here. So number 23, number 24, Herbie Hancock, as I talked about with John McLaughlin, even Pat Metheny to some extent. But like John McLaughlin, he comes from the Miles Davis tree. He had a crossover dance hit with Rocket in the '80s. Highly influential to musicians, people that want to learn the piano and the keyboards, that want to play not just jazz, but jazz, funk. It's pretty pathetic that he's not considered. He probably would be put under a category because I don't think he would necessarily be voted in because it's not the jazz community that'd be voting on him for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But put him in under the jazz. He's one of the top 5, in my mind, category artists that are not from 1965 or earlier, at least. Definitely. Herbie Hancock should be in. I think if he got on the ballot or if enough people brought him up, they start considering more jazz, he will get put in, but it hasn't happened yet. Number 20, he even won Grammys a couple years ago. Number 25, Diana Ross. This is pretty pathetic and egregious. You think about some of the female artists that she's in with the Supremes. That happened 20 or 25 years ago, I think. If you're putting in Dionne Warwick, if you're putting in those 80s pop artists like Whitney Houston and Janet Jackson, you know, how is she not in ahead of those people? She had solo hits, in the 80s, but in the 70s, I'm coming out or whatever it's called, and Upside Down, whatever. She had several hits. I mean, again, she was in with the Supremes. Fine. This whole distinction about you're in it with a group, you can't get in solo. It shouldn't. She had enough of a solo career. She should be in. I think if she got on the ballot, she would probably get in, or she might just be, again, the musical excellence or probably early influence even. Early influence might make sense because, I don't know when her solo career began. It was late 60s, early 70s. Tina Turner's in too. Tina Turner's maybe a little more rock, but Diana Ross should get in, 25. Number 26, Kenny Loggins. Well, you just look at how many hits he had that ended up in movies in the 80s, and he should be in. I mean, how many like the I'm All Right from from Caddyshack to Beverly Hills Cop was Beverly Hills Cop 2 to um he has like all these sort of themes and mantras kind of, iconic tracks. He probably has a dozen songs that were on very successful, high-selling soundtracks. The criticism is, well, he didn't have like this massive album-oriented solo career or like his own solo music that was released outside of the soundtracks. He had some, but mostly the songs that he got known best for were songs that were featured in movies, but he was really successful. He knew he could make a living doing that. He had Loggins and Messina, so maybe you consider that work. Sort of like with George Michael, they considered the Wham work as well, I guess. But I think it's pretty egregious. I don't know if I mean he should be in ahead of Billy Idol for sure. Despite the fact Billy Idol had those two or three songs that were massive at like weddings and stuff. I think more people actually know Kenny Loggins, think of him a little more iconically. Him and like Huey Lewis. So I don't know. They need to be pushed for him to get in, but get him in before he needs to get put in. Maybe he gets put in a category again. Number 27, Boston. Like Styx, like Kansas probably, but especially like Styx. They get on the ballot. I think if Foreigner and Bad Company get in, are getting put in, they got to get in too. Their first album was massive. It's always the album that people think of as like the most acclaimed debut album. And the production, it took like 5 years for it to come out, and they worked. Tom Schultz worked endlessly on the thing, and those songs are all played on classic rock radio. And most people that know anything about classic rock know every one of those songs. The rest of their catalog is actually pretty good. It's just not that prolific. But I mean, Amanda was a hit in the 80s. The second album, Don't Look Back, had a few songs that were played, and um, they have a very popular cult fund. They could probably still headline at arenas. So Boston, if they get on the ballot, I think they're in. It's just a matter of if you're getting these other AOR bands on the ballot, you got to put Boston on there. Number 27. Number 28, Blue Oyster Cult. This is pathetic too. I mean, just for Halloween, the iconic use of Don't Fear the Reaper in Halloween alone. But they actually were very critically acclaimed. It's just they're still a cult band from a stand, and they only had a couple other tracks that were like known, like I'm Burning for You. But from a standpoint of like musicians knew them, they had a large influence on the evolution of hard rock and heavy metal. If you're putting Thin Lizzy in, and they haven't got in either, these guys probably deserve as much, if not more, recognition. And a band like King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, I contend, would not exist. At least a lot of their music, they've evolved so much and done so much stuff, but a lot of their music owes a lot to Blue Oyster Cult. Actually, I would say the same thing about Ghost. There's several bands. I mean, I'm not a massive fan. I'm not that knowledgeable about a lot of their catalog, but I just know from reputation and people talk about loving BOC. Blue Oyster Cult, it's pathetic that they're not. I didn't even realize that. I just looked it up. It was like 3 or 4 years ago. I was like, Blue Oyster Cult's not in the Rock Hall. They have to be. I mean, I've actually put them a little higher actually in this, but number 29. I've talked about this. Olivia Newton-John. If you're putting in pop acts again, Barbra Streisand, I could also include with this, but Olivia Newton-John had several top 10 and even number 1, number 2, number 3 hits in the mid to late 70s and into the early 80s. Physical especially. Yeah, Phil Collins, I think, deserves it almost as much, in some ways maybe more, because I think he had even more top 10 hits. But for pop acts not in the Rock Hall, and in terms of who came first, she's obvious. Why are you putting in the likes of Whitney Houston and Janet Jackson when you're not putting in her in first? Again, I'd say Barbra Streisand, but at least Olivia Newton-John got known for Grease, and her songs are slightly more iconic than even Streisand, even though Streisand had several songs that charted in the 70s and ended up in the top 10 also. So that's number 29. Number 30, Luther Vandross. There's just a documentary about the guy. He had a very prolific career throughout the 70s and 80s especially, early 80s. Yeah, I mean, among R&B artists, and he collaborated with like Bowie, and I mean, that documentary might help push it. Maybe not this year, but that's how I firmly believe the Go-Go's and a few other bands got in from having documentaries done about them. But that documentary opened up a lot of thoughts about, Luther Vandross is was successful enough. He should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Among R&B acts, I mean, you got Cool in the Gang a couple of years ago. How many other R&B acts that haven't got in that or of that level? There's a few like James Ingram, I guess, but Barry White I don't think is in. Um, but Barry White's more known for his like sort of vocal style and his deep voice rather than the songs he did. Although he had some iconic, and I personally love the Love Theme, but he doesn't even sing on that. It's actually released under like a group with him or whatever, but is on his record. Number 31, the Guess Who, or the Guess Who slash Bachman Turner Overdrive. Just put Randy Bachman, I guess. They pissed off, I guess, someone with the Rock Hall a few years ago. I don't know if it was John Wenner specifically, or maybe Steve Marsh. But they're another classic rock band that goes back, way back into like the late 60s. Guess Who specifically. They had several hits. If you were having CCR in the Rock Hall, which they got in, I think they got in the late 90s. The Guess Who's been eligible forever. That's a little bit like the Spinners. I mean, why in the world is the Guess Who not in here? And it's like, again, you could include BTO, then you could just call that, the same, just like the Joy Division New Order thing. Because BTO had several hits too, of course. I mean, American Woman. Lenny Kravitz, it's probably on this list, but a little lower. If he get in, one of his, not his biggest hit, but one of his biggest hits was a cover of American Woman. But yeah, I guess who are, and I think if they got in the ballot, I think the people would storm it, or they'd be put in, the people would vote for them for sure. So number 32, Sting. One of the first names on this list that actually has been nominated, didn't get in. While he's in with the Police, his solo career, especially his albums in the 80s to early 90s, were pretty. He had several hits on every one of them. And some people prefer his music, even though it's a little lighter and less rock. It's some of his sort of adult contemporary and stuff like that. And he dove into jazz. And later in his career, he went into like ethnic and world music or whatever with the albums that was done with lute. But I mean, he had several songs outside of the Police. He tours frequently, very influential. Iconic voice. He sang on Dire Straits, got in a couple of years ago on Money for Nothing, and he co-wrote that song. He should be in. And he was nominated once, but they haven't gone back to him. The same thing happened to someone else, Peter Gabriel. Forgetting Peter, but Peter Gabriel got in the first ballot actually. But I think he would get in if he got nominated one or two more times, or they'd put him in. But anyway, 32. Number 33, Megadeth. Metallica's in. Judas Priest is finally in, sort of. But metal is so underrepresented. Rage Against the Machine. Why in the world is Rage Against the Machine not in? Now, I think it's more important to put Iron Maiden in before them. Motorhead, the argument can be made they could go in, but as far as thrash music, which was the biggest form of heavy metal in the 80s and basically since in some ways, because of Metallica especially, they're the second biggest. Dave Mustaine, of course, was an original member of Metallica, or he was on the first EP. People say Slayer and I wouldn't say Anthrax or Testament, of course, like that. Or Pantera is the other one that you could have to consider. They were a little later and they weren't thrash. They were more like a groove metal band. But for metal bands, biggest metal bands, they're among, if not the big. And Dave Mustaine, they were on soundtracks. What is it? Rust in Peace, Peace Never Sells. They had a few really like albums that went like multi-platinum. It's egregious that Metallica got in 15 years ago and they're not in. They haven't been nominated once. I would have put them around. They would have been the next. Priest makes sense, but I would still consider nominating them. They should be nominated before Slayer, for sure. Anyway, and they should get in. They got to put more metal in, and they're an obvious name. So that's number 33. Number 34, Chick Corea. I mentioned John McLaughlin, Herbie Hancock. Chick Corea, highly prolific, iconic keyboard player, composer, jazz artist that played with Miles Davis, and then had this hugely prolific career, forming Return to Forever, some of the finest collection of musicians in one group or band ever, really. Progressive and jazz fans always recognize him. He won several Grammys. He didn't, commercially, I guess you could say, he didn't really go super far. I'd say Herbie and even John McLaughlin to some small degree. John McLaughlin was once on The Tonight Show. But I think actually he has even more of a prolific of a solo career than his other body. He had the Electric Band in the 80s. And among musicians, he definitely is as, if not more respected. And it's sad that he's not with us anymore. But, if you're going to you got to put jazz and jazz rock, jazz, post Miles Davis, he's among, if not the biggest name. the most important name in terms of influence. Any keyboard player, Yes is in. Rick Wakeman would cite him. Any keyboard player of the last 50 plus years would cite Chick Corea as an influence. Keith Emerson. Number 34. Number 35, the last name on this particular video. I'm going to do a second one maybe next week. Tool. Well, you did put Radiohead, and again, that's, in the metal bands, you're putting the likes of Soundgarden in. Tool, as much as I'm not a huge fan, they used to give me headaches. I can't deny they're massively influential. They can headline arenas. They barely ever put a record out. They had like whatever it was, like a 14-year gap between their fourth and fifth record. But it didn't matter. It's like a whole community of people that love their music, love their influences among musician types, among metal and hard rock, among sort of 90s, post 90s, rock fans especially. They should be in before any rock band, before the White Stripes, before any rock band in the 2000s easily. And they should have been put around the same time as Radiohead. Their influence is nearly as big as Radiohead. Radiohead maybe is slightly bigger commercially. They've reached the largest, quotient. They can tour to probably even bigger numbers, but the influence is very comparable. They're a comparable influence of the last 30 years, and of course in the progressive scene as well. Industrial music, Nine Inch Nails is in. Nine Inch Nails were a contemporary of them basically. They got in a few years. They got nominated several times. Tool should be in. They should get nominated. It's just they don't have like pop hits really. They had a few videos that were big on MTV though, but they kind of did their own thing, like Zappa. They did their own thing and didn't give a rat's ass about what anyone else thought. And they kind of just have built this enormous following and influence. If they get in, you're gonna maybe see, of course, Muse and the Mars Volta, and like even Coheed and Cambria possibly. You'll see bands like that have a chance to get in. They need to get in before them. Of course, Dream Theater too as well. And even though Dream Theater I think predates them by a few years, Tool needs to get in before, if Dream Theater ever has any chance, which I think the chance is minuscule. But Tool is known. They have a cult following, and they have a massive cult following, and they're gonna put rock bands of this era, of the last few eras. They're as big, if not bigger, than any of them. So anyway, so that's the list of the top 35 Rock Hall snubs on my list. I'm going to go through the next 35 in another video, I hope at least. I can just go through it now, but I'm not going to do that. But thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.